A lot of people tend to think that God is overly restrictive, that He doesn't allow us to have a lot of freedom. And so there might be a tendency for some of us to want to push back against those restrictions, against those guidelines. But I think that would be a mistake. I think in reality, when we look at the big picture of things, God actually has our best interest in mind. And by following some of these things that we deem to be restrictive, in reality, it's for our own good. And perhaps let me give you an illustration. Many years ago, my wife and I traveled to Italy, and I've always been a big fan of Lamborghinis, these Italian sports cars. And so while we were in Italy, we noticed that we were very close to the Lamborghini factory. And so we took a short excursion to this factory and saw these beautiful Lamborghinis being created and built in this factory. And of course, one of the things that we all know about Lamborghinis is that if you own one, the way the manufacturer tells you to operate them is to operate them on roads, on smooth roads, specifically highways and other curvy roads. And that's the best way that you can enjoy optimally how a Lamborghini is supposed to function. Now, one thing they definitely tell you to do is don't take these Lamborghinis off-road. Don't drive them over rocks or on dirt or try to take them on jumps, because that's just not what they're designed to do. And if you were to do that, if you were to ignore some of the restrictions, some of the guidelines, what you'll come to find out is that your Lamborghini, your $100,000, $200,000 automobile is going to get damaged very quickly. And that's not because the people who are making Lamborghinis are trying to rob you of joy or to limit your freedoms. What they realize is the Lamborghini is made to function in a certain way. Go outside of those boundaries and you're going to have significant damage. And it's not going to be fun. In fact, you're going to be strapped with debt, because you're going to have to try to fix the car in a very significant way. And I believe that this is a similar kind of picture as to how God has made us and given us certain guidelines and restrictions, right? God says, man, you are supposed to function in this way because this is how I made you. And He's given us guidelines. And though we see them as restrictive, when we realize the big picture is, man, He's given us these restrictions so that if we veer off and go beyond these guidelines, it'll cause damage, it'll hurt us, and in the ultimate scheme of things, it'll become more restrictive if we violate those guidelines. Let me just give you one example of what might that look like. Suppose, for example, we look at the guidelines that God has given us with regards to sexuality and how we're supposed to function sexually. A lot of people might say, oh man, I want to push back against that. I don't want to follow God's restrictions. I want to be free to have sex with whom I want or when I want. But what we don't realize is that those boundaries are meant for our good. And if we were to violate them and engage in promiscuous behavior, then that might ultimately come back to hurt us. For example, we might get a sexually transmitted disease, or maybe through repeated sexual encounters, this might eventually hurt us. Like we tend to bond with people who we are sexually intimate with, and to constantly have that kind of bonding and then having that kind of breakup will eventually cause emotional, psychological turmoil in our life. And this will become eventually more restrictive. So ironically, these guidelines that God gives us that we seem to suggest are restrictive ultimately are for our freedom and for our flourishing. And when we violate those boundaries, ultimately those decisions lead to more restrictions in our own life. So that's just an example of how God's guidelines, God's so-called restrictions are ultimately for our own good, ultimately for our own flourishing. And they are intended because God made us and He knows how we're supposed to operate, how we're supposed to function.